Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Rick out to talk to you about something that's very near and dear to my heart, which is visual natural user interfaces. Thanks, Rick. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Kristin.
Good to see you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm honored that I was invited to give this talk. And as I'm sure those of you who are getting a little tired at this late in the day realize, I'm the person standing between you and the dinner cruise. So I'll try to make this entertaining, but there is some wonderful science going on in this field. And my main area of research is computer vision. I do publish in computer graphics, and there's a very rich interplay between the two fields. But what I'm going to talk about today is primarily computer vision, and I've sort of handpicked 4 recent successes that I think are very interesting in terms of the kind of technology they use and some common themes, for example, big data. But before I start, I want to give sort of a brief introduction to the field, and I'm going to allow myself to be a little sentimental and give you a sort of brief history of computer vision. And one of the reasons is I just finished writing this book. It took far longer than I wanted it to. But in the process, I got to think about the timeline of what has happened and what the important things are in our field. So if you go back all the way to the 1970s, and I'm not sure how many of you were already doing computer science research back then, relatively few people in the audience, I would guess. But these were the early heydays of artificial intelligence and robotics. Among many other fundamental breakthroughs in computer science, communities of scientists at places like MIT and Stanford and Carnegie Mellon were looking at artificial intelligence and trying to build intelligent systems and autonomous systems. And in those early days, it was believed that the key to intelligence was logical reasoning and things like that. So things like recognizing what somebody was saying or recognizing what's in an image were not considered to be the real deep problems. And so Marvin Minsky asked his graduate student, Gerald Sussman, who some of you probably know from MIT, to just spend the summer and link a camera to a computer and get the computer to describe what it saw. And this was going to be a summer intern project so they could get on with the really important research. Unfortunately, we're looking now 40 years later, and the problem has still not been solved. And my ongoing bet with my colleagues and younger students who care to listen is that I'm going to retire before this problem is adequately solved, that we can have computers performing at the level of a 4-year-old, let's say, describing what's in a scene. But that remains to be seen. I definitely have seen a strong surge of recent young Turks who say we're at this cusp now where there's enough data in the world that we can learn our way out of the problem. And that's some of the themes I'm going to talk about today. So if we just look at what people have done over all of these decades in computer vision, there's a large list of technologies. And of course, reading them, especially when they're sideways, will give you a sore neck. So rather than doing that, I'll just give you some pictures to sort of remind you what some of the top contributions and ideas have been. So very early work had to do with just interpreting line drawings. How do you tell the shape of an object from its contours? People quickly realized that you could build these kinds of elastic graphs to describe the appearance of an object, that the eyes were near each other and horizontal, but they were above the mouth. They also realized that recognizing objects had a lot to do with parts. So a human body is made out of arms and lower arms. And we're going to see shortly how this impacts the work that's going on with Kinect. Other fundamental technologies were things like intrinsic images, figuring out where the shading is in an image, optical flow, what's moving, some very early work by Ted Adelson, Peter Burt, that was really starting to work in the field of computer graphics. So taking images and doing the kind of analysis and synthesis that gives you a seamless blend between an apple and an orange. Other things, various kinds of mathematics like regularization, Markov random fields, range scanners. So the image in the lower right is a range scan from, I think it's Angkor Wat, done by Katsui Keiichi. And those large industrial range scanners have proven to be a very mature and well-working technologies in industrial applications. Again, seeing that reduced down to a $150 consumer product is a real breakthrough in our community. We've done things with recovering structure of scenes from moving objects, stereo. In the lower left, you see face tracking. This is work done by Simon Baker at Carnegie Mellon when he was still a professor there. It's now the basis of what is in Avatar Kinect. So basically, we can now do real-time face and expression tracking on your Kinect device. And a few other sample pieces of research. The top row indicates a lot of the work in image-based rendering, where we build 3D models and re-render them, and computational photography, where we pull apart images or multiple images and put them back together. Now, on the bottom row, the right two images are sort of iconic placeholders for image recognition. And this really remains to today the big open challenge in our field. How can we understand what things are? So for simple objects like motorcycles, relatively simple, we've made some good progress. But for other things that are more complicated, like recognizing dogs, we really can't do it at all. So to this timeline, I'd like to add sort of one late addition that isn't in my book, but I think is sort of obvious now. And this is massive data. I'm sure in your own fields, a lot of you are dealing with this and seeing the huge potential. I mean, e-science is a lot about this. The success in speech recognition is mostly due, I think, to good applications of machine learning to very large amounts of training data, because every time you pick up your cell phone and talk to some automated speech recognizer, it gets better. So one of the themes in my talk today is going to be how massive data has impacted computer vision. So here's an outline of what I want to talk. And as I mentioned early on, I'm going to sort of have 4 vignettes of 4 things that I think are really exciting and new in our field. The first one is the 3D body tracking that is in Kinect. So how many people have tried Kinect at a friend's home or something like that? OK, good, over 50%. So it was a very secret project at Microsoft. Just the fact that Microsoft Research was working on it was kept under wraps for a number of years. But fortunately, Jamie Schotten and his team of collaborators in England were allowed to present the technical details behind what they did at the computer vision conferences this year. So I'm going to basically show you Jamie's slides to explain a little bit about how the machine learning helps solve this problem of tracking the body in Kinect. Then I'm going to talk just very briefly about medical image segmentations. And one of the reasons this is brief is that Steve White and his collaborators at Amalga tomorrow morning will have a session where they actually talk in more detail about the science and the mathematics behind it. But it's another one of these examples where large amounts of training data really help. So I want to just briefly mention that. Then I want to show you what some of the successes are in object recognition, in particular how you can now recognize things you might want to buy in the store with your cell phone, but also talk about some of the limits of that and where it breaks. And then lastly, I'll be talking a bit about what do we do with this large amount of imagery that's on the internet. There's tons of imagery. If a computer vision algorithm in the cloud can somehow match them up, can we do new and interesting things with that? So that's some of the work, the research behind our photosynth service. So, the common theme throughout these things will be that massive amounts of data, often found on the internet, are playing a key role in some of the breakthroughs we're seeing in computer vision. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them during the talk. So please just throw up your hand. We have microphone runners, I think mostly for after I finish talking. But if someone has a question, it's a small room with good acoustics, so you can just shout out if you want to stop me at any point. Otherwise, I will start and go through some of these areas. So the first thing I want to talk about is this body part recognition on Kinect. And here, I'm going to use the slide deck that Jamie showed at the Face and Gesture Recognition Conference. So as most of you know, the Kinect is a peripheral device that plugs into the Xbox. Now you can also buy it and connect it to your PC, and there's an SDK available from Microsoft Research that basically runs the body tracking and audio processing pipelines, so you can then use them for higher level applications you might be playing with. It tracks 20 body joints in real time. It does face and voice recognition, and it allows these kinds of games without any kind of controller. For a lot of us, looking at the Wii was a breakthrough because rather than being bound to the computer with a joystick or something like that, you can now move around and play a game using whole body motions. The Kinect obviously went one step further and removed the need to hold any device and still be able to sense all of your body motions. So how does it work? Basically, it's doing human pose estimation. And I'll tell you a little bit about the previous approaches. This has been largely an unsolved open problem in our community for about 2 decades. And then I'll give you some details about how the Kinect approaches. It's fundamentally tied to the fact that we have a depth camera. It uses body part recognition using machine learning techniques, and then it produces a full track skeleton. So the task with human pose estimation is to basically start with somebody and be able to figure out where all the key joints are, because the joints and their angles basically determine what the skeleton is doing. And you can then use that to drive a synthetic character or to decide whether you successfully intercepted a soccer ball or anything like that. So you're trying to produce the skeleton, and that means you're measuring the locations of all of these nodes and also the angles of all of the joints. So this is a very classic formulation of skeletal body tracking. Now, what happens is if you have an image like this, and you're trying to solve the problem, it's quite difficult. Now, right here, it's not difficult for you to say, oh, I know where the hands are, that's fine. You know, this isn't an issue. I can see exactly what's going on. But when you go to more cluttered environments, and let's say varieties of clothing and varieties of body shape, and then all kinds of convoluted motions, it can get very, very difficult. But this just shows you sort of what the Kinect is doing in real time. So why do we want body tracking? Well, obviously, the big consumer application that we're now shipping is gaming, right? And you've all seen it in action, so you sort of understand why it's there. But furthermore, we think it has a lot of applications and user interfaces. So the middle top image is a surgical theater, where now instead of having to touch the computer to change the imagery you're looking at, you can use gestural interfaces. Telepresence is another possibility, basically driving some sort of a remote avatar. Surveillance, of course. You want to know where the people are, what their activities are. Physiotherapy, more of a medical thing. We haven't really seen demonstrations of this yet, but I'm sure people will be using the Kinect to measure things like the amount of lymph in a person to see if they're improving over time. Dance, sports, obviously. There's a whole subfield of sort of physical body science called kinesiology, where people study movement of people. And this gives us a sensor today that is low cost that lets us do that kind of thing. Now, let me be clear. The Kinect is not the first system to do whole body tracking. There are commercial systems that use things like markers, but they're very expensive, they require a special room, and so on. If we want to do this just on regular people, it's very hard because of the large variability of poses that people might have. There's also very large variability in people's shape, morphology. Age, that's another issue. And then clothing. You know, if you think about it, if it's obvious to you that you can always point to where the 2 legs are, that might not be the case with a long skirt, right? So you have to do a lot of inference about what the possibilities might be. Camouflage, I assume there's a picture of a person in there. I'm not sure. And of course, clutter, right? If you have multiple people playing a game or multiple surgeons in a room or whatever, you have to deal with an image that can be arbitrarily complex. So if I just took a small part of this image and said, is there an arm in there, and I cropped out the rest of it, you'd probably be hard-pressed to answer that question. So it's a very challenging problem. And as I mentioned, there are commercial tracking systems, and they are very accurate and very fast, but they require you to wear something, and they require you to be in a special room. So it's just not available for mass deployment. Now, the computer vision approaches, as I said, there have been several decades worth of work. There are several axes you can describe the work on. One of them is whether you are tracking the motion or whether you are just recognizing the pose. And this was an interesting sort of fork in the road that the Kinect team had to cross, and I'll tell you in a minute how they resolved it. Then there's the idea of, do you have sort of a single monocular image, or do you have, let's say, a collection of cameras, 3D? Well, obviously 3D is easier, but may not be as easy to set up in general. And then, are you tracking the whole body at once? Are you trying to recognize it sort of as a pattern, like some kind of a silhouette pattern? Or are you trying to understand the pieces and the parts, right? So these are all sort of technical questions, scientific questions that anyone designing such a system has to either ask or evaluate. So how did Kinect solve the problem, right? Now, in general, all of these techniques have proven to be slow and unreliable and not deal with a large number of poses. So the problem with tracking is that you have to initialize, and then after a while, if you move too fast, there's just no way for the system. So a tracker, for those of you who are mathematically oriented and you know about Kalman filtering, right? The beauty of a tracker is you predict where the state is going to be, and then you correct the measurement, right? But if the motion is too fast, it's outside of your dynamical model, then it doesn't work. Or maybe the search space becomes too large. And not only is that a problem in terms of computational load, but the number of false errors you might induce if you're searching over too wide an area gets too large. So basically, tracking was the technique that the Xbox team first used to solve this problem. And after working on it for a long time, they said, gosh, we can't make this work. Let's go find some people at Microsoft Research who maybe can solve the problem for us. And the people at Microsoft Research looked at this and said, we might be able to solve the problem, but we can't do it by making your tracker better. So that's where they started with the Kinect camera. And in case you haven't looked at one carefully, there's basically a color camera in the middle. And then there's an infrared emitter, which sort of projects a speckle pattern out into the world, and an infrared camera that looks at the speckle pattern. So this is what the infrared camera sees. And because we know what the speckle pattern is, we can do small amounts of local matching and get this kind of a depth map. So the depth map, as done by Kinect, is a wonderful sensor. It's cheap, it's fast, it's relatively accurate. You'll see a side view in a second. But it does have missing pixels, so that's an issue you have to deal with. So here's a video showing what it looks like from the side and the top. So you can see that the accuracy is quite good. In other words, if you ask someone to kind of draw well, I guess I got my videos out of sync. But basically, if you ask someone to draw what the body shape is from the top and bottom views, you get the correct amount. Now they're all synced together. So you can see that the actual depth camera is producing good data. It's not very dense, but it's quite good. So if you compare color imagery versus depth imagery, the depth imagery is actually a much better choice. As it says on the right, it works with low light. The person is very obvious. You don't have to worry about what the background looks like. The scale is known, so you're not, with regular imagery, you're never sure if you're looking at something small really close up or something big really far away. There's a uniform texture, so you don't have to worry if you're going to synthesize what the input looks like. You don't have to worry about what the actual color of the clothing is. So we can just take a computer graphics model and synthesize depth images. And as you'll see shortly, that turns out to be one of the key components to making the Kinect body tracker work. So you still have these problems about pose variability, shape variability, some appearance, shape due to clothing as well. So one approach is to match the whole person. So here, basically, on the right, you're seeing some work where if you can get the silhouette of the person, and that's why the person's standing in front of a blue screen, because then you can just find the non-blue pixels and get a silhouette, then you can match to a big database of silhouettes, and the database is annotated with poses. But you need a huge, huge database to do this, because if you think about the exponential complexity, each time you have a degree of freedom, right, that's one dimension, and then you add another degree of freedom and a third one, and the overall space of all potential silhouettes is very large, and then you have to multiply that by all the numbers of potential body shapes and clothing and so on. So part-based model is one where you would try to detect particular things like hands and so on. And this is essentially the philosophy that scales better, because if you can somewhat reliably figure out where the hand is and the elbow and the shoulder, then by knowing that they're connected together and they have to have a certain distance with them, even if those measurements are occasionally flaky, one will compensate for the other. So you can build something out of pretty decent part detectors and then use the kinematic structure, the skeleton, to put them together. So when Jamie and his colleagues in Cambridge were approached by the Xbox team to solve this, the internal name for that was called Project Natal. And they basically were told that you have to be able to work with anybody, any age that moves up, and it's not allowed to fail, because during a game, the last thing you want is for the character to stop moving. So they also had a limited compute budget, so they had to be very disciplined. The Xbox is playing a game. A lot of that compute budget is going into physics simulation, and so they only had 10% of that budget. So this is basically what they started with. There was this prototype tracking algorithm, and that's, if it runs, you can see that once you initialize, it works fine, but what if the person moves too fast, right? So if you basically start moving a little bit too fast, and the video on my laptop is just stuttering a bit, but at some point it fails. So initially, they were told that they had to initialize the tracking and recover from failures, and they were going to do this by body part recognition. So here, you can see the output, and the color encodes what it thinks the body part is. So they've decided that the hand will be colored orange, the head will be colored red, and so on. The neck is green. In between, it's not quite sure if this is head or neck, but as you'll see, it's okay to have this kind of a slop. When we put all the pieces together, this is good enough, right? So the technical details were presented at the Vision conference last month in Colorado Springs, and this is basically how they work. So it's a frame-by-frame recognition system, and it estimates for every pixel in the depth image which part it thinks that pixel is, and it computes a probability distribution. And it's done by using massive amounts of training data. So you need a runtime system that is very fast, that can just look at the pixels and decide what's going on. And it can't do some kind of exponential search. It can't sort of iteratively fit a model and see how well things are fitting. You basically have to look in a small local region and decide, by looking at a set of pixels around that, what you think the body part is. So let's look at how this works. This is the input depth image and the inferred body parts, right? And again, you can see that the system is tracking pretty well, right? It's not making a lot of mistakes. The hand stays blue, the other hand stays orange, the head stays red, and so on. So this is the result. Now, how did they do this, right? So within the overall pipeline, you start with the depth map, you infer the body parts, then you hypothesize the body joints by looking for the sort of center of mass of each body part, and then you do a skeleton fitting and tracking, right? And this shows you the difference between basically just doing the tracking, which is in red, or doing the tracking with the body part recognition. So you can see the yellow part is the part that's always re-recognizing at each frame what the body part configuration is. And it's not getting lost the way the red thing is. So the way the recognition works is built on previous work that was done at the Cambridge lab on image segmentation. So they would take an image and they would figure out which part was the cow, which part was the water, which part was the grass. And the approach technically it's called a discriminative approach, which means you look at the data and you make a series of decisions to produce a probability distribution about what you're trying to decide. So in terms of statistics, you're trying to learn a classifier that produces a class, what color of body part do I think it is, for each pixel. And you're going to use a lot of training data. So the key, I think, to the project, which no one else had tried before, because most people were working with real images, is to generate synthetic training data. So it's easy enough to build a model of a person. There are all these great CAD and animation systems, so you can now buy software and dial up the kind of person you want, the age, what clothing they're wearing, and you can even have pre-scripted dance movements and things like that. Actually, in this case, they didn't need pre-scripted things. They went into a motion capture lab, and they captured all of the motion that they thought, you know, a soccer player might want or something like that. So you can imagine having this huge database of motions and a large database of possible people and shapes and things like that, and you just generate thousands and thousands of training examples. And for each one, you know what the output color should be, because your computer graphics model says this part should be called the hand and this part should be called the elbow and so on. So you basically have into your learning system perfect, clean data, right? You know what the depth map is, you know what the output should be. Now the question is, can you learn it? What kind of machine learning technique would you use? So because it had to be fast, this is just an example of the training data. So you see you've got hundreds of different examples, but actually it turned out after they'd been running this that hundreds isn't enough, so they scaled it up to thousands and then tens of thousands. And I'll tell you in a minute how many they ended up using. But this is all the training examples that go into the system. So the way they ended up doing this is using a technique called random decision forests, or discriminative decision forests. The actual mathematics of that, I think Steve White will talk about tomorrow morning. So if you're interested, it's the same technique they use in medical image segmentation and organ recognition. So come to the talk tomorrow morning to hear that. But basically, what you can do very quickly is you can pick up 2 pixels. So you pick up a pair of pixels. Let's say the yellow pixel is the one you're trying to classify. You say, well, what if I went over 6 pixels to the right and I measured it? is that pixel at the same depth as me, or greater than me, or bigger than me? And you make a decision. You sort of decide, are you going to look for something greater or smaller and set a threshold? So you only have a couple of parameters. Now, of course, there's a large number of pixels you can choose. But if you do this learning algorithm, you can eventually figure out that for this particular part in the image, it's like almost learning what the 20 questions are for each location, right? Like, OK, for this pixel, the first question I want to ask is the pixel 5 pixels above me significantly behind me? OK, well, maybe that's part of the head or part of the shoulder. It's certainly not part of the stomach, right? And the system will learn what the 20 questions are for each pixel. And it's done using a very well-grounded, well-understood machine learning technique. So here's all the potential questions you ask. And as it turns out, one of these questions will be the most useful at discriminating that particular pixel's color, what it should be, which body part it should be. So after that, you sort of basically do all of these measurements, and you pick the question which is best at separating out the body colors. So there's some particular question that sort of reduces the entropy after answering the question. You're a little bit more sure about what the body parts are after asking that question. And then you recurse, and then you keep asking questions, and you build this tree. And the tree is very fast at runtime, because for any pixel, you basically go down this list and say, OK, where do I look next? I just do a numerical comparison, and I do a Boolean branch through a lookup table to now see what the next question should be. So it's a very fast runtime. And so you train these things, and I think I'll gloss over some of the details here because Steve will be talking about it. But basically, if you ask the 20 questions, the question is, how many questions do you need to actually be able to answer this? So let's look at what happens. If you just basically ask 2 sets of questions, all it can do is kind of discriminate the lower part of the body from the upper part of the body. It's not very good. But as you ask more and more questions, by the time you've asked 8 questions, it's pretty much nailing where the head is, but not necessarily, right? Down here, it thinks that shoulder is part of the head. So it didn't ask enough questions, right? So the top one looks pretty good, but it's going to take a lot more questions before it can answer the bottom one. So, OK, around 16 or so, it's starting to get the head, right? And the beauty of this is it's just an automated technique. It's a machine learning technique. And so if you ask the question, what depth do I need for good performance? Well, surprisingly, the answer is about 20. I mean, actually, it keeps going. And this is actually revealing the secret of how many training images there were in the Kinect body part recognizer. If you just start with 15,000 training images, after a while, you saturate at about 45% accuracy. And if you have 900,000 training images, which is the number they actually went with, they didn't actually even see a saturation here. And I remember when Jamie gave the talk, he explained why they stopped here, but I just can't remember. So there's some reason. Either 20 was the maximum amount of time they could run, or they just couldn't. I think training these data sets actually involved running a compute cluster for several months. So they probably could only redo this experiment a few times before they shipped. But this is where they stopped. And as it turns out, this performance is good enough to what you see in the actual game. So this is just a schematic of what kinds of things are the trees learning. And so here's a twist on the decision tree, is that a particular tree may kind of not give you the best answer. So if you re-randomize things and build a bunch of different trees, and that's called a forest, and then you combine the outputs of the forests, you get better performance. So again, here is what happens if you have a single tree, but if you combine 6 trees, then it works better. So again, the more trees you're combining, the better it works. OK, and then another thing you might want to optimize for is how far away are you allowed to look? I said move 5 pixels over. Well, it turns out that if you move sort of a maximum of 63 pixels, that's a lot better than only moving, let's say, 13 pixels. And then the number of training images. So that's sort of the technical details. And now once you've figured out what the body parts are, then you can figure out where the center of each colored region is. This uses a particular segmentation technique called mean shift. And then from the locations of the centers, since you know which each body part is connected to the other body part, then you can fit the skeleton and potentially throw away things that don't make any sense. So this is mathematics about the mean shift. And this is what it looks like, right? So now you can see the inferred body parts in the upper right, and then the actual joint locations in the lower, on the lower strip, right? So it's doing well. It's not really making mistakes. Now, of course, when a hand goes behind the back or something, you lose that part, right? So then something else, maybe the tracker with the velocity of what your wrist went behind the arm, is going to have to decide what happened. But in some ways, for the game, it doesn't really matter because you're not going to use this part behind your body to stop a ball or whatever. And this is what it looks like with two people. Now, this gets more difficult because you'd think that, oh gosh, it can get confused. And yes, indeed, if you look in the upper right corner, the colors are a little bit more mixed up. They're not quite as clean. But mostly the dots are staying okay, right? So again, we lose little bits of the dots as the hands move behind the back and so on. But this thing was from the get-go designed to track multiple people, so it couldn't use things like silhouettes. And it works very well. So here's some examples of failure modes, crossing your arms. I have no idea why this one's a failure mode. It looks like a real easy one. But as with any system, you have failures. And when you run your machine learning algorithm, there's a certain percentage of failures even after the learning. You can't throw them in and force the system to get those cases right because more cases will go wrong. So yes, there are failure modes. But in practice, when you play the game, there are relatively few. So I'll skip over this. I'll skip over the ground truth comparison. And this is sort of the final demo. The system takes under 2 milliseconds. So it's grabbing images at about 30 milliseconds, and then it's using less than 10% of the budget. So they came in under budget on the Xbox. So that's it. And this is the final stage, which is then going from the body, the locations, to the full skeleton. So you have to basically match things up, throw away things that are inconsistent, and do a little bit of temporal prediction and verification to make sure it all works. So this is the sales video of people doing wonderful things with the Kinect. So I think I'll probably skip over this unless people want to see lots of kids and other people having fun. But it's great. It is an amazing success story. Probably one of the things we're proudest of this year, and really put Microsoft ahead of the competition in one area. So. And these are just new things you can do with it, right? You can basically control your sound system and things like that with gesture recognition. Newer work is this Avatar Kinect. So this is using a face model to now track the face and the expressions. So as you move your head and so on, the character is mimicking that. So you can have these virtual sort of get-togethers with your friends, even though you're each in your living room. You can sit together in a 3D space and talk with the rest of your friends, and it will mimic your face. So this is using a different set of technology. This is what's called active appearance models, but this is part of this whole sort of family ecosystem of Xbox Kinect technologies that are based on computer vision. So these are some of the take-home thoughts. First of all, the depth camera was an absolutely essential component of the success story. The key insight was that you couldn't rely on tracking. You really had to have a system which is doing independent measurements on each frame. The body part representation was kind of the major insight that turned out to be the correct design point. And huge amounts of training data, 900,000 examples generated with computer graphics trying to span the whole variability of people and their appearance was the key. You can see that without that, if you only took 15,000 examples, it wouldn't work nearly as well. So that's the end of this particular talk. I'm going to go back to the main presentation. Are there any questions on the Kinect system at this point, or this work? No? OK. Then I'm going to keep going. The second topic I wanted to briefly mention is medical image segmentation. These slides were prepared by Antonio Cremonesi, who is the main researcher at Microsoft Research Cambridge. He's working on a number of scientists here at the Amalga, the medical imaging medical informatics group here in Redmond at Microsoft. So let's kill that, and let's go have a look at Antonio's slides, which are here. OK. So this is the task, right? So you have an image like this, and the question is, where's the kidney? Now, quick biology question. Can someone sort of shout yes when I point at the kidney? OK, where is the kidney? No. Very good. Wow. Okay. I guess you still remember your anatomy classes. But in general, it's kind of hard, right? I mean, this is the kidney, right? And is that the kidney? And this is the variability between patients, right? So if we actually play this video and look at all the potential views, I think this is going to play. Let's see. Well, anyway, this was a video which shows lots and lots of images of people. Oh, I think it's thinking about playing. No. Okay, there we go, right? So look at all these images, right? The kidneys look very, very different. They have different kinds of contrast, different appearances. So it's very difficult. And as a matter of fact, either a radiologist or their clinical assistants spend a fair amount of time just going through these volumetric data sets just to find where the kidney is, so then you can sort of crop it and zoom in and do your actual diagnosis. So there's a huge amount of variability. So how did they solve this problem? They basically set out to write a system which would be able to locate where the major organs were. And initially, there are a number of applications for this, but the one they first wanted to solve was to just speed up the task of a radiologist or any clinician looking at the medical image by just focusing in on the data that they want to look at, right? So how did they do it? Well, they basically had a large labeled database, right? So the kidney, the kidney, the kidney, the kidney, the kidney. Again, huge amounts of appearance variation. And how do you what do you do with this? So they started with the label database, and the idea here is to go from something like this to an isolated thing like this, where now you can just see that bounding box. And so if you can imagine taking the CT data and doing a volumetric rendering on all the body parts and the stomach and everything else is getting in the way, if you could just isolate that part right away, you can see the doctor has a really good chance of just visualizing what they're looking for, right? So here's what the ground truth database looks like. Again, large variety of things, different croppings, different amounts of noise, contrast. For those of you who don't know medical imaging, contrast is a dye that you get injected to be radio opaque or otherwise affect the imaging. Resolution, a lot of the scanners, MRI versus CT, have different spatial resolutions. And as with Kinect, different body shapes and so on. So very large amount of variability. And now the question is, well, what kind of technical approach could you use, right? And the answer actually, in some way, isn't surprising because this was done by the same team. Antonio and Jamie were both co-authors on earlier work for regular 2D image segmentation and classification using decision forests. So it's a very well-proven technique when you sort of have to look at some part of an image and say, what do I think is happening here? What is this likely to be? So again, they did decision forests, and this is where all of the details you want to know about will be revealed tomorrow morning. But in practice, it works very well. So they now have this library where they've taken the image data sets. They've labeled them. As those of you who work in medical imaging or medical informatics know, there's all kinds of issues just in getting these databases, patient privacy and so on. But they've assembled this library. They've done the training. And now they have an internal prototype that they're evaluating to help clinicians figure out how to look at images better. Another potential application that they're still evaluating to see if it's valuable is image registration. And again, for those of you who've either worked in medical imaging or talked to people, this is one of the holy grails, because if you can register various images together, you can either do a longitudinal study of following one patient over time and seeing, like, are there tumors growing or things like that, is something changing? Or you can do cross-sectional studies across the population, say, what does a normal kidney look like? What does an abnormality look like? But you have to be able to register the things, right? And as we all know, not only is the body, somewhat deformable in things, but the amount of variability due to the way people grow is huge. So you have to be able to do that. So now if you can sort of roughly recognize where the left and right kidneys are in two images, then you can put them into correspondence roughly and then use some kind of a finer measurement, like something that matches the outlines to do the final elastic deformation. So the summary on this medical image part is that primarily this was done to do the automatic organ segmentation. And it's used to do this kind of zooming in. And the trick here, again, was to learn a detector for each organ class using these random decision forests. And as I've mentioned, it can also be used for registration. So Amalga is our medical informatics sort of part of the Microsoft, and it's undergoing alpha testing, which means it's just internal testing, not for the public yet. So any questions on this work before I move to topic number 3? Question there.
So how does this relate to the normal, supervised classification kinds of stuff done in image analysis?
So this is supervised, right? I mean, you have training data, right? So you'd have to tell me exactly which kind, but there are people who, for example, try to classify pathological, non-pathological tissue, things like that, right? I don't work in the area, but I'm not sure if people have applied this kind of classification to volumetric data across a number of modalities, right? This will put in, input a variety of modalities, and that will specifically tell you sort of where the organs are found, right? So in some ways you could say, oh, this was just a new problem that no one had tried to address before. But maybe if you work in the area, maybe you know of related work.
I guess the question is it using shape? Is it using texture? Is it using...
That's a great question, right? So again, the decision forest is this amazingly stupid technique, right? In computer vision, we'd say, well, or even for body parts, you'd say, well, what's the right thing? Okay, we first have to find the contours of of where the edges are in the image, and then we'll do something on local shape. And the answer, the decision forest, is doing nothing more than asking questions about pairs of pixels. It is so stupid you couldn't describe this algorithm. I mean, if you told someone, we're going to play 20 questions, and your task is to just go look at a pixel and tell me if this value is bigger than that value, right? You say, oh, what a dumb game. This is boring. The surprising thing is that it works. And I believe it's the same technique here. Actually, Steve White tomorrow will explain everything, so he's the right person to ask. Other questions? OK, so let's go on to topic number 3. And I hope people are finding this interesting. I'm sort of giving you an overview of a number of different topics in computer vision. So this is the ad for tomorrow's session on medical visualization from 9 to 10:30 in Rainier. Topic number 3 I'm going to talk about is object recognition, and in particular how we can now do things like this on the cell phone or some combination of the phone and the cloud. So a lot of this work was developed by Larry Zitnik. He's a researcher in my group. But it was done in collaboration with people like David Nister, who was at Live Labs, who's now at Bing Vision. In fact, the whole history of this technology is some of the initial publications were done by David while he was an academic at the University of Kentucky. And then Larry started working on it here, built a system based on those ideas. And then David came and joined Live Labs, and now he works in the product group, the Bing product group that actually ships these technologies. So what are we talking about? So object recognition, again, in some ways is the holy grail of computer vision. It's the big unsolved problem. Sort of name what's in an image at the quality level of a 4-year-old. We can't do that, right? But people have solved the problem in special cases, like if it's a rigid object, like a sneaker or a telephone, then you can kind of search over the image and find where it is. Or if you have a scene, then maybe the car recognizer and the people recognizer and the building recognizer can all feed off of each other, because you know that the people and the cars are about the same level and they're in front of buildings and so on, right? Or maybe you have something like a 3D model, and so you can recognize little patches on the 3D model. So these are all previous approaches to this problem. And generally, it turns out what you're trying to solve is sort of build a system out of these well-known components that people have studied. So we need some kind of feature. Is it texture? Is it contour? Is it something, those of you who do computer vision maybe have heard of something called SIFT, a scale invariant feature transform, right? So what are the features? And then what are the representations? How do we put the features together? Are the features some kind of elastic model where the two eyes have to be at the same height and they have to be above the mouth? Or is it just a bag of features found somewhere in an image? And this bag of features is taken from bag of words, which is a very popular and highly successful technique in information retrieval. It turns out that just counting all the words in a document is a very good discriminant metric for figuring out what the document is similar to. And then, of course, there's a lot of machine learning techniques. And this is really an area where computer vision has had a major change in the last decade, that the learning techniques have become embraced, and we publish at machine learning conferences like NIPS, and we keep using better and better machine learning techniques to do these problems. So if you look at the complexity of recognizing things, it turns out there are some problems that are easy and some that are hard. So one that's relatively easy is duplicate detection. I'll tell you a little bit more about this. Recognizing barcodes is easy and now ships in most cell phones. Recognizing two-dimensional objects, which means something that is printed like the cover of a DVD, was not a solved problem until David and a few years earlier people had started working on it, but is now generally considered a solved problem. I'll tell you more about that. And then there are harder things like location, which sort of works. For landmarks, you can do it. For a random suburban house, you can't yet. General 3D objects is much harder. Once the objects start becoming more categorical, like shoes, it becomes very difficult. Articulated objects are harder. Categories, especially animals, and especially animals with very large variabilities in their breeds, like dogs, are extremely difficult. And things like understanding a whole scene and actually reasoning, using the sort of common sense reasoning we do about, well, why this thing can't be a chair because it's, you know, under a car or something like that, is another thing. Now, it turns out that some things like whole scene reasoning can actually improve the performance of individual components. So there's a big sort of synergy in this space. But in terms of what can be done and shipped today, the Lincoln system that Larry and David developed basically focused till now on these three problems, and this is what we're shipping. So I'll tell you about the first one, which is duplicate detection. So let's look at a bunch of images, and you say, well, are these all the same image, right? Well, you can probably tell they are. This one's a lot blurrier, but yeah, you know, the hands are in the same place. This one's black and white. This one's tiny. This one's rotated. So why is it rotated? Well, maybe somebody took the original image and thought it looked more edgy after rotating it. But you'd really like to be able to figure out that the original image for this one that's somewhere sitting on your disk, there's the original high-resolution one because you want to print it, right? So these are actually, I believe, exact duplicates. But if you took this scene and took a bunch of photos of that person just holding still to get the best pose, we'd probably call those near duplicates as well, right? I mean, it depends on your definition. But let's say for now, the definition is one where really the only thing you're allowed to do to an image is kind of rotate it, scale it, and then blur it, right? Or do black and white. So that's one definition, right? And why might we want to do this kind of thing, right? So when you're finding search results, you don't really want your top 5 search results for an image search to be the same image, unless you care about the web pages they came with. You'd like to see a variety of things on the web page. So just being able to tell if your search engine is sort of being redundant is useful. Another thing is copyright search. Sure, you might want, you know, maybe you have some photograph and you want to make sure no one is ripping it off. The last one is removing illegal images, and a lot of you may not know what illegal images mean. I mean, obviously, images that infringe copyright are illegal, but there's a much more pernicious set of illegal images, and these are child pornography images. So Microsoft, Larry Zitnik has worked with some researchers at Dartmouth and the Center for Missing Exploited Children, and he developed this technology that we license for free to anyone who wants to use it, called PhotoDNA, which basically will quickly find duplicates of images on the web. The unfortunate thing about child pornography is it's sort of shared virally between people, and you want to quickly find where those images are and tamp them down, remove them from public sharing sites, prosecute people, and so on. So the way it works is you want something that's very fast, because you can imagine a service like Facebook or SkyDrive that we share, you know, millions of images being uploaded. The servers are just uploading this stuff. And maybe you have a millisecond or two to look at the image as it's being uploaded to flag it as a potential problem image, right? And the problem images are known. They're registered with the government, and they know what they're looking for. So you're not trying to recognize whether an image is illegal. You're just trying to match it against a known set of bad images. So the way Larry solved the problem, he had to sort of take the existing technology and really dumb it down in a sense to make it work fast for this technique. So first you make the image square. Then you make it black and white. Then you compute these descriptors, which are a lot like SIFT. You basically look at all the edges, and you count how many edges are in each orientation. And you do this sort of roughly over different regions, because if somebody's cropped the image, then it will have moved around a little bit. And then you kind of compute a fuzzy hash. So you have this hash, which is a binary signature, where the Hamming distance between the signatures should hopefully be relatively small for matching things. So then you can use fast hashing retrieval techniques. And the current performance of the system is you find about 95%, which is much better than not finding them in the first place. You have 1 in 100 million false positives. The false positives, you will, of course, have a human verify things before any prosecution happens. But you want a very, very low false positive because you don't want to have a lot of people paid to check for this. So this is where they did the design point. And it's a success story. It's now deployed. It's being used by the government. It's being used by other people like Facebook. So this is an example of where computer vision is actually being successfully used in a restricted domain. Another example I want to show you is this 2D instance recognition. So here the problem is I know what the DVD cover looks like, but somebody might pick this up in a store and might want to know what's the review on this, or how much can you buy it for on Amazon, right? So you can see there are a lot of variability in the images. So how is this problem solved? So, we might want to recognize the real-world objects. We might want to search using an image. So if you see an interesting poster for an upcoming event, it'd be great if you could just recognize the poster, and then there's a database of everyone who puts a poster up around the city to the URL where they want your phone to jump to. But you might have to deal with the image being a little curved and things like that. Or maybe you want to add metadata to the image. For those of you who rip music on your computer, you know that after you put in the CD, it goes off to Grace Notes to figure out what the actual names of the titles are. So maybe you want to take an image out in the world and be able to add metadata. What did you just take a photo of? So technically, the approach here is you find these things called interest points, and then you extract these little square regions. And after extracting all the square regions, you then build descriptors around them. So each square region itself is broken up into little subregions. In the subregions, you compute the edges, you compute the orientations of the edges, you histogram them. And then to make this whole thing tractable is you take this histogram, which you can think of as a 100-dimensional real-valued vector, and you use KD trees, or clustering, whatever you want to call it, vector quantization, to come up with often about 1 million different cluster centers. And so each one of your patches gets classified into one of 1 million categories. And then what you do is you use this trick that's known in databases and information retrieval, which is inverted indices. So for a new image, you take the, let's say 300 patches. You name each of the patches as to which of the 1 million words it is. And then for each database image, it will have its sort of set of patches that it's found. And now what you're doing is you're basically counting how many patches match in this database. And you say, oh, this one has 3 matches, so I think it's the best match. And then you can go in and do things like verify whether the image is really matching by then aligning it precisely and saying, is there a good rigid match between the 2 images? So this now runs. It's been deployed. Mango is our upcoming release of Windows Phone that is already out in beta. And there's a component of that called Bing Vision, which you can test out. And basically, you can point your camera at a book, and it will go into the database and recognize which book it is, and then take you to Amazon to show you what the reviews and the prices are. So this is something that is now deployed and working. This is a summary slide that Larry often uses to explain what object recognition looks like, what works and what doesn't. So this is sort of a different way of interpreting that line of what's hard and what's easy. So on the left are things like books and magazines and things like that, paintings, all these flat things. The maybe category, places you can kind of do, storefronts, yes. The no category, people is a funny one, because right now we know that it works quite well in your family members. So if you just want an automatic login to your PC, there are families with twins and things like that. But roughly speaking, in the average family, you can tell the difference between people. I believe, talking to my colleagues, that the problem of, let's say, recognizing a terrorist entering the Super Bowl is still not solved. But I've also heard rumors that some people claim they have it solved. So I don't know. I haven't seen definitive evidence that we can recognize a face against a database of 1 million or millions of things. And then things that are very sort of variable. I think pets is the most hard one. I'm trying to work on cars this year. It's hard. It's very shiny. But the nice thing is that cars are 3D objects. So if you can get over all the shininess and sort of figure out which car it is in which pose, then you can verify. So, but even there, some of our preliminary results show that, yes, it's quite easy to tell a sedan from a minivan, but to tell an Odyssey from a Sienna is still hard for us. So let me move to the last segment. My speaker prep says I have 7 minutes, so I'll see how much more I can get through, and then we can go have some questions. So the question of internet images is really exciting, because you have these specialized databases, like medical databases, but the internet itself is contains billions of photographs, right? And some of these photographs are labeled, or you know which web pages they were found on. So what can we do with this? Noah Snavely, one of today's award winners, and Steve Seitz and I started working on this problem. And we wanted to see if we could somehow make the experience of browsing photos of locations more pleasant. And so rather than scrolling through pages and pages of Rome or Trevi Fountain, why can't we do something like build a 3D model and then navigate by saying, I'd like to see photos of this particular location. So what the system does is it matches the photos using very similar technology to what I just showed you for object recognition. And then it builds a 3D model of the scene. And then after you have the 3D model, you can explore things. So I'll show you some videos that explain how this works. So this is the matcher and the modeler. So it starts with 2 images, it keeps matching images, and then it's simultaneously building up this point cloud model of the scene. Then once we've done that, then we can kind of go into the scene, and this is just a way of visualizing where all the points are and all the images. And in the upper right corner, you've got a navigator with a map. So you can say, oh, what does the scene look like from there? But not only can you do that, you can also go say, show me a better view of that building. So it finds another image of that building, and it moves you there. And then if you want to move to the right, you can move to the right. So you can think of this as a way of arranging all of the photos from this old town square, which I took these photos on one of my trips there, and arranging them in a way that you can move around and still get a sense of where things are relative to each other. So this is the navigation system. And then there are other things you can do after you've annotated the images. So here, for example, is Notre Dame. And if you're a user and you know a little bit about this area, and you say, oh, I know the name of those statues on the left. They're called the Left Apostles. So I'm going to type in Left Apostles. Now, if you look along the bottommost strip of images, I'm not sure you can see it, but little squares just started appearing in the bottom. What's happening is the system is automatically tagging all the other Flickr images it found with your annotations, because there's a relationship between what you annotate and the 3D point cloud. Where those points are seen in another image, you can transfer the annotations. So now when I move to other photos, everything gets relabeled. And it works even if there's somebody in the way. It says, well, I'm not going to put the annotation at the Last Judgment because I didn't see those pixels in that image. So this is really starting to show the power of the internet. By matching images on the internet, we can transfer things like knowledge and labels from one image automatically to other images. So we got very excited about this work, and I talked to a number of people inside Microsoft, and we decided to build a sort of commercial strength system called Photosynth. And Photosynth is up and alive. It's been alive for a number of years. It's a consumer photography sharing site where you can upload collections of photos you took, and it will build one of these 3D models and let you navigate between them. How many people have seen Photosynth so far? Okay, most of you. And I don't know how many of you have tried uploading images, but it's a fun thing to do if you come back from vacation just to give it a try. Now, we have other tools that also let you stitch images into big panoramas, and that's another way of sharing photos. But basically, there's a lot of technical components. In addition to the basic work we did in phototourism, this system also uses multi-resolution zooming on the images for a fast experience. But it was a very exciting project to both do it at the University of Washington and then to take it in-house and turn it into a Microsoft offering. So this is just one of the ways we kind of work at this boundary of academic and industrial research. So one thing you might ask is, well, how well does this scale to the internet? Well, one of the problems when you go to a place like the Trevi Fountain is there are thousands of images. And if you've put them all into this reconstruction, then there's just too many images to see. So wouldn't it be nice if you could just see what the best images are, what the representative images are? So in follow-on work, Noah with Ian Simon and Steve had this paper where they took all the images from a location like the Pantheon, and they did the reconstruction, and they started looking at which images are redundant, which ones are all looking in the same location. Maybe those are the important locations. And so they could take a set of a few thousand images like this and automatically say, these are the 6 most important photos. These are the ones that sort of lie at the cluster centers of the places where a lot of photos have been taken. And almost by total coincidence, this result is so nice that it's spooky. I always like showing it. If you go to Wikipedia, or if you did in 2007, these are the 6 photos that are found in the Wikipedia article on the Pantheon at the time, right? So just amazing coincidence that, the front of the building is the same one. This is the inside. That's the oculus, the hole in the top of the church where the rain comes in. Here, the 4th most popular image is from the inside looking out, the Wikipedia article has the front portico. But just this spookily coincidental congruence between what the editors of Wikipedia and what the crowd thinks of. So, you've all heard the term crowdsourcing, right? The wisdom of the crowd sort of said that these are the 6 most important images of the pantheon, as measured by the people who upload images to Flickr. Another thing you might ask is, well, we've done reconstructions of Notre Dame. Can you scale this up to a whole city? And it turns out that that takes a lot of technical breakthroughs. So there was a team of people at the University of Washington who worked on this. The goal we set out was to reconstruct 1 million images from Rome in a day on a compute cluster with only 1,000 nodes. And we didn't quite meet that goal. It was just an arbitrary number. And, Rome in a day sounded good, and 1 million and 1,000 just seemed like good numbers to pull out of a hat. But we were able to do it in, Noah, how long does it take to do Rome? Is it 2 days? Day and a half. OK, so pretty close. The city I want to show you is actually a different city that I discovered. I just heard of this Dubrovnik, and I thought, well, here's a city that probably people haven't gone out and photographed extensively. But it turns out there are millions of images of Dubrovnik. The beautiful thing about Dubrovnik is there's a ring of hills around it. So a lot of people took aerial shots of the city. And this really helped knit the whole city together. When you reconstruct Rome, you get clusters of landmarks. But in Dubrovnik, you actually get the whole city reconstructed. So this is what the automatically generated reconstruction looks like. And you can fly down and say, OK, take me synthetically down the main street, and then turn around at the clock tower, and look at the church. So as you see, the reconstruction here is very point-like, because that's the mathematics behind what we're doing. We're basically matching these feature points, figuring out where they are in 3D. But it really gives you a good overview. In every single photograph that was registered, you now know where it was taken. But you might ask, well, what about real 3D? Can we make things feel more three-dimensional than just these point clouds? So in follow-on work, we did some work where we basically took these data sets with the point clouds, and we extracted straight lines, and we fit planes to them, and then we could build 3D models. So what this looks like now is you start with your data set, and you might just have 14 images, and you can create a point cloud model. But you can also extract the lines that are basically pointing upwards and horizontally, and cluster those into main directions. So the red lines are the vertical lines. The green lines, we'll call them east-west. The blue lines are north-south. And if you do a regular photosynth or phototourism-like transition, because we're blending between whole images, you get a lot of ghosting. But if you pop out a 3D model and then do the same kind of interpolation, what you're looking at is still original images, but every time you interpolate between the images, you map them onto this crude model of the world, and then you cross-dissolve. And the whole effect is much better. I'm sure you'll see particular artifacts, but as an experience to basically view a collection of images, this is much more compelling. So we're continuing to work on this. We had some demos at TechFest, where basically now we can use a cell phone camera to grab a sequence of images all around an object, send it off to the cloud, reconstruct this kind of a 3D model, and then it comes back and you can kind of spin the model on your cell phone. So this is sort of the latest work which we've previewed as a technology demonstration. So I'll skip over that. So there's this question of regular internet images. And if somebody from the organizing committee would like me to stop exactly on time, I'm happy to wrap up. But I've got 5 more minutes or something like that, then I'll keep going. OK. So the thing about phototourism is it relies on matching lots and lots of images of the same scene. Primarily, I mean, you can use photosynth to take photographs of your car or of your wedding gown, of your child's art project, whatever. It works fine. But it's kind of for three-dimensional objects seen from a different variety of viewpoints. What about just regular images? What about all the images that have been labeled with Labrador Retriever? What can we do with things like that? Well, it turns out that a large fraction of the computer vision community is focused on that problem. They're saying, what can we do with this plethora of images? And there are a number of databases out there. There's one at MIT called Label Me, where people can upload photos and then trace over them. One of the largest ones right now is ImageNet, which is done by Fei-Fei Li at Stanford. And she's collected 12 million images so far. I mean, it's easy to collect billions of images, but she's collected 12 million images where the labels for each image as to what it is have been verified by Mechanical Turks. So these are 12 million correctly labeled images, which is a wonderful data set. And they keep adding. And in order to organize the images to say, well, what labels do we want? And they basically went to their colleagues in the sort of machine translation, natural language community, the people who think about semantic hierarchies, and they took the WordNet hierarchy, which is a hierarchy of what they call synth sets. Synth sets are sort of synonyms, right? And they decided to just focus on the nouns, and they took the most popular nouns, and that's what they started searching for. So they would go out, and when they wanted a noun like cat, they would go to the search engines and do cats, and then they do a little bit of pre-filtering, and then they have the mechanical Turks basically decide, are these good cat images? So it's a lot of work, but it's a very rich data set. And in fact, there's so much excitement around this area that now we've started seeing courses and workshops on this area, which you may not have heard of because it's kind of a buzzword that those of us in computer vision are throwing around, but we're calling it Internet Computer Vision. And so Svetlana Lazebnik, who's another faculty fellow awardee, ran a course at UNC, Tamara Berg at SUNY Stony Brook. There was a workshop at CVPR 2009. There was another small workshop in Banff that same year. And there's a special issue of the Proceedings of the IEEE. So, you know, a very, very hot topic in computer vision right now. So if we have time, I want to show you just one more demo of something cool. And this is brand new, hot off the press, hasn't been shown to the general public yet, although as with most academic publications, you can go to the web and download the video and read the paper by now. But this will be presented at SIGGRAPH next month. And this is work that Larry Zitnik and Michael Cohen did with their intern, Youngjae Lee, from Kristen Grauman's group at UT Austin. And it's called Shadow Draw. And the idea is, well, you have all these images, and there are all these labeled images. What else can you do with them? So they said, well, maybe pictures can be used to help people draw better, because most of us have trouble drawing. I mean, not all of us. Some of us have taken classes or are artistically inclined. But most people, if you ask them to draw a bicycle, I mean, being computer scientists, most of you probably don't have pen and paper right in front of you. But if you do, you can try to, well, the problem is there's a picture of a bicycle here. But if I asked you to just draw one, the question is, could you do one? Or can you do a head, basically, and put the eyes in the right proportion in the head, right? So there are all these images. Can we somehow use the photos to help people draw better? And they developed this system where you start with a partially completed user drawing, like this, and then you go and you create these descriptors that I've told you about, and then you basically go into your database of thousands of images, and right now you have to tell the system what you're looking for. Eventually they'd like to get away with that, but for now you say, I'm going to draw a bicycle. So it goes and picks out 1,000 bicycle images, and it does matching on the bicycle images, and then it figures out what the typical edges look like in the bicycle images, which ones agree with each other. And then based on where your pen position is, it kind of creates a shadow that lies under your drawing. So in the end, when you're drawing, you might start off with something like this, and then as you're drawing, these shadows pop in and help you refine your photo. So the video itself is quite a bit of fun to watch. And this is really the last thing I'll show you, and then we'll be wrapping up. So this is the SIGGRAPH video. And basically, you're watching the system in action. This is 2 times real-time speed, just so you can see more examples. But this is what people drew when they were just first asked to draw. OK, so that's the quality of the drawing. So people aren't always sure what a bicycle looks like, so you have to erase. So that's the before picture. This is what it looks like when you ask people to draw with Shadow Draw, right? So the shadows are sort of popping in, and they're all based on matching images on the web. And it can give you enough guidance so you kind of say, oh, yeah, I think I want to draw something there. So there's a shoe. OK, what does it look like? OK. There's what is it, a face. OK, now, do I want a man or a woman? Well, I'm going to keep drawing, and then we'll see what happens, right? So it doesn't force you to draw anything. But it gives you this guidance. And so that's kind of the before, and that's the after, right? So you might look at the after and say, those aren't great pictures. Go back to art school. But it's something. It's something interesting. I mean, in research, we like to throw things like this out there in the wild and see what happens, right? So these are technical details on the paper. And I think I'll just stop, because I've told you the rough thing. You can certainly go to Youngjae's website at UT Austin and have a look. So I'm going to wrap up. I hope you found this interesting. But I think the main top-level thing I want to leave you with is that it's a very exciting time to be working in computer vision. I mean, I've been working in the field for 3 decades, and I've always thought it was an exciting time. But in many ways, it was a very difficult problem with very little progress to show. And now we're really starting to see breakthroughs. And a lot of this has to do because we're applying machine learning techniques to massive amounts of data. Not the only thing. There are lots of very sophisticated mathematics, optimization techniques also maturing and things like that. But it's having a huge impact. And some of the things I've told you about today are things like body tracking and medical imaging and object recognition and internet scale reconstructions. So that's the good news. The converse of that is I still believe that you won't have a system that can name things in an image as well as a 4-year-old by the time I retire. So I still think it's a wonderful open problem for people to work in. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention. So I'd love to have questions from the audience.
Circle, and they're going to go to the boat. They're going to go back to the hotel, and they're going to go to Building 33. If you are going on the boat ride tonight, you're encouraged to park here because parking is a challenge out there. And you can check your bags on the boat itself. So go ahead and take them with you on the boat. Don't be nervous about that. So are there any questions in the audience? Where's the mic? Oh, there it is. Okay.
Okay. Testing. It's a very impressive talk. I think it's one of the most impressive talks that I have seen in computer vision. The theme of the Microsoft Faculty Summit this time is Future World, right? So talk about 2031. So a question that I have in my mind is, what is the grand challenge that you will envisage, say, by 2031 on computer vision?
Right. It's a great question. And I think what I'm going to tell you won't be much of a surprise because I sort of started with this and I'm still ending with it. I think there are a lot of things that will be solved. I think we will be able to recognize car models and recognize most manufactured objects and things like that. And we'll be able to basically go into an environment, whether it's with a Kinect or with a regular camera, and walk around and build a 3D model, and we'll continue to get better. Self-driving cars are probably going to be a reality, whether we'll deploy them or not. The work that Sebastian Thrun has been doing is very exciting. I mean, it's amazing the quality levels of what they have. So a lot of things will be solved, and vision, I think, because it's a passive vision at least, just cameras and so on, are relatively cheap and power light sensing modality as opposed to something which has to, for example, emit light. So I think vision will just be used a lot more. I mean, Moore's law is on our side because vision does compute take a lot of computation. As you know, a lot of your cortex is visual cortex. It takes up a lot of computation in the brain. So I'm placing my bet for the grand challenge as being general recognition and understanding. And I like to formulate it as being able to describe an image at the level of a 4-year-old because it's fairly crisp. We can all agree what that is. And it sort of implies a particular Turing challenge, right, which is a Turing test. You basically show images to a computer and a child, and you have somebody transcribe both results. And of course, it's tied up to other parts of artificial intelligence. Like, it would be more interesting if the child gives a narrative, and it'd be more interesting if the computer did. So, we also need good work in natural language generation to do that, and so on, right? But I think that will remain the grand challenge. It's just of all the problems that I've seen. I've seen great progress on things like stereo matching and figuring out what the shading is and all kinds of other technical problems. The one that seems to remain is just general recognition.
I'm curious whether any of the new techniques you're using are giving you plausible hypotheses as to how the brain recognizes images.
Right. That is a wonderful question. And of course, that question of whether computer vision will give us insights about human and animate and natural system vision is has been there from the beginning of the community. And if you look at some of the people who started the work in the early 70s, they were very interested. And there used to be a lot more interplay with people who, for example, would go to ARVO, which is the Natural Vision Science conference, and go to CVPR. Unfortunately, there are relatively few people who still split their time that way. Ted Adelson, Aude Oliva, a few people at MIT are sort of the exception. There was also a lot of hope. My PhD thesis from Carnegie Mellon was under the joint supervision of Jeff Hinton, who is one of the names in what we now call machine learning, but he called it connectionism, or neural networks back then, and Takeo Kanade, who's a roboticist. But back then, we had study groups with the, some of the people doing neural science at the University of Pittsburgh to see what we could figure out. So there is still a small community of people, like, for example, David Lowe claims that his scale invariant feature transform was inspired by the way the visual system works in the cortex, and Tommy Poggio has a follow-on paper that's inspired. In something like the Kinect body tracking, first of all, there's a depth sensor, which we don't really believe. I mean, we know that stereopsis is working, and it helps a little bit, but as far as I know, from what we understand about human vision, stereo matching helps a little bit to pop things out, but it's not really used as a primary cue for recognition. And the idea that you'd have sort of a tree of decisions, we know roughly speaking what the outlines are of animate biological visual processing, right? It's layers of nonlinear center surround transforms and so on. So, and then of course what's known in the higher levels of the brain is very much unknown. So I'm not the best person to answer that question. It's a fascinating question. There are certainly people like, for example, Aude Oliva, who is more of a human vision person at MIT. She's organizing a workshop next month at MIT on the frontiers of computer vision. What are the next big problems? So I think people will keep looking at that. But it might be a little bit like speech recognition, right? We're not really sure if we understand how the human system recognizes language, but we know that in computers, even the basic modeling of cochlear processes and so on, that's been abstracted to do Mel-Kepstral spectra and things like that. But after that, we run this big Markov hidden chain with learned feature detectors, and I don't know if it really says a lot about what the human system does. It's this open question that the substrates are so different and the ecological imperatives are so different, right, about what a live system has to do to survive and to perform well, and the context in which it does it, right? Certain things about the visual system, like our ability to recognize by color, may be rooted in primates' desire to eat fruit that is ripe, right? So I'm kind of, I'm free associating here. I can't say that right now I could take a learning from some of the recent vision successes and map it back to something that has predictive value for natural vision systems.
Go ahead, please.
Kind of an off-the-wall question, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the outliers that you've seen in your research, and not outliers in the sense like images, for example. And not outliers in the sense that you're going to use them to correct or refine or train data, but just outliers for their own sake, and whether or not they cause you to think about, oh, this is why a person might have taken a photograph here, or about this thing.
Right. So if you're asking, what are the outliers, like, let's say you say, it seems like everybody tends to frame this particular photograph from this aspect, but then these are the ones that don't meet that, right? So is there something interesting in the data that doesn't sort of match the statistical distribution, right? I can't think of any work I've done right now. Noah is continuing work at Cornell with David Crandall and Dan Huttenlocher and others, analyzing, for example, the distribution of photographs of landmarks around the world. So there might be something in there. Now, of course, outlier detection, again, not in the sense of a bad matching feature point, but in the sense of anomalous behavior, is a central question in something like surveillance, right? So people will look at, what's the typical motion for somebody in this airport, and everybody's going this way, and somebody sort of doubles back and goes like this a few times and then goes through a door. Maybe that suggests something, right? So there is that kind of outlier detection as a goal in itself for which visual processing might be used. Is that the kind of question you're asking, or was it something else?
Yeah, that's very interesting to me because I'm quite interested in digital divide issues in places that are not photographed.
Oh, okay.
In body types that are sufficiently different,
Right.
you want to recognize the difference and not try to generalize.
Sure, and this is, of course, a big danger in any machine learning approach or statistics, right? That if you try to fit a distribution, you can force the outliers to fit it and then sort of ignore them, right? I mean, this is only vaguely related, but one of the first things I did when I came here at Microsoft was I'd already worked on image stitching, so lining up images and getting background photos. Turns out this is a very good way to compress certain kinds of video. So if you have a tennis match and the camera is panning over the audience following the players going back and forth, you can save a lot of bits by taking all of the background people and basically pasting them into a single synthetic image and just replaying that image back and forth. And it doesn't matter for the tennis match. But if it turns out that one of those audience members stood up and shot the tennis player, then you would have compressed away the only interesting data, right? So in a similar way, you know, if you're looking at human behavior and you say, well, let's just figure out on average what kids do, then maybe you can't detect the precursors to autism, right? But there are people who look at this, like Jim Ray at Georgia Tech is specifically looking at analyzing video to measure social engagement of young children, you know, and the ones that are either diagnosed as autistic or how young can you go and do predictive diagnosis. So that kind of thing is very interesting. You know, I don't know the people in Kinect if they did a lot of analysis of what kinds of things, you know, what are the real outliers. Like, for example, are handicapped people something that was or wasn't in their database? I actually don't know. That would be a fascinating question, right?
Okay,
and in terms of the digital divide in photography, this is strange to report, but when I first told Noah, let's do Dubrovnik, because it'll be a city that is beautiful, but Google will never drive the streets and map it, right? I was dead wrong. Google ended up driving every single street in the world, as far as we know. So there is no sort of, I mean, maybe there are still villages in the Andes somewhere where people could download their photos onto Photosynth and create a little 3D map of their city because no one else will, right? And that might be part of the digital divide.
Favelas and ghettos in South Africa are
Yeah.
an example where people never go.
I see. Right. Yeah,
Well,
no, the favelas, exactly. And if those people want to organize, you know, again, most of my emotional energy is around visual imagery, right, and those kinds of things. So I can sort of think most in that space. But if community building in that space was enhanced by having a collection of photographs and making people's own feel a more sense of ownership and building a little community map and then posting update photos of what they saw and things like that, there could be, you know, room for things like that.
And we probably have time for just one more question right there in the center, please.
My question is related to, you know, computer science and computer vision.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of these problems have been proven to be NP complete,
Okay.
like graph matching and
That's right.
stereo body part combinations and so on.
That's right.
Given that theoretical question and, you know, sort of the intractability,
That's right.
and given the context in which you're saying these are success stories,
Right.
I just wanted you to give your viewpoints about how the theory is important.
Sure, sure. The theory is very important. I mean, let's look at something like the precursor to the Kinect work, which was what Jamie Schotten and Antonio Cremonesi, they were using Markov random fields coupled with decision forests to create what's called conditional random fields. It's well known that inference in a Markov random field, if it has certain kinds of loops and certain kinds of energy functions, is NP-complete. Raman Zabi at Cornell established this with his graduate students, right? That doesn't mean there aren't good approximating algorithms, and the quality of the approximation algorithms keeps getting better, right? And even though you can construct a reduction from, you know, you can construct instances of the Markov random field inference problem, right, through reduction to an NP-complete problem, that doesn't mean that most typical image inference problems are, right? So I think the answer is yes, there are NP-complete problems. Sometimes people will just change the algorithm or the definition to remove the exponential search, like in this case, rather than searching over all possible poses with hypothesize and test, you have a bottom-up evidence aggregation, and then you only have to do a small amount of thing. But I think breakthroughs in approximating algorithms, and even for problems that are kind of known to be convex, like even quadratic, you know, minimization, sparse linear system solving, we're still seeing breakthroughs there, better kinds of multigrid, impacting some of the the things in computer vision. So the theoretical aspects in terms of better algorithmics are essential. So I really focused on massive data and statistical models, but some of the big breakthroughs have been more in the area of algorithms.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rick. We really appreciate the talk, and thank all of you for coming.